Okay, I just started it.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Becky LeBoy. I'm the Education Outreach Specialist with Ocean County Soil Conservation District, and I'm here tonight with my Jersey Friendly Yards colleague, Karen Walzer, Public Outreach Coordinator with Barnegat Bay Partnership. And I want to remind everyone that we're recording this webinar, and the link to the webinar will be on the Jersey Friendly Yards website events page tomorrow. Welcome to our Jersey Friendly Yards 2021 webinar series, What's Bugging Your Jersey Friendly Yard? This series includes 6 webinars presented by bug experts focused on understanding and appreciating bugs in your Jersey Friendly backyard. And tonight we are thrilled to have Dr. Dan Duran, who will be presenting his program called Cultivating Respect for Insects, an overview of the ecosystem services that insects provide. Dr. Duran is an assistant professor at the Department of Environmental Science at Rowan University, as well as the naturalist for Scotland Run Park, a 1,300-acre nature preserve at the edge of the New Jersey Pine Barrens. He has published research papers on agricultural entomology, biodiversity, and molecular phylogenetics. Dr. Duran has described 10 new species of insects previously unknown to science. I think that is pretty neat. He received a BS in environmental science from Stockton University in 1998, an MS in entomology from the University of Missouri in 2002, and a PhD in evolution and ecology from Vanderbilt University in 2010. In between his degrees, he has also worked for the Natural History Museum in London, UK, and the Smithsonian Tropical Research Institute in Panama. Dr. Duran is a co-author of the book, A Field Guide to the Tiger Beetles of the United States and Canada, second edition. Dr. Duran will be answering your questions at the end of his presentation. Please be sure to type your questions into the chat and please address them to all panelists or to everyone. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Dan Duran.
Great. Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really excited to talk to you all today about why insects are so important and a lot of the things that people don't think about when they think of insects. And so first I want to put this in the context of insect diversity, and I really want to explain why pest diversity is not as high as you might think. We spend so much of our time thinking about a very small number of extremely bad insects, but they're not representative of the vast majority of insects on this planet. And I want to talk to you about why you should value insects more than you already do, even if you do. And also how you can personally promote insects in your yard and beyond. So, if you look at the diversity of life on Earth, I mean, it's spectacular. There's so many different kinds of things that we have. We have amazing birds and jellyfish and ctenophore comb jellies and cheetahs and all kinds of crazy things out there. But I can tell you the biodiversity on this planet is not evenly distributed. There are certain groups that are much more represented on Earth than other groups. And when you come right down to it, out of the 1.6 million species that are known on Earth, the vast majority of them actually fall into 2 different groups. Insects, which are about 60% of all living things on this planet, and plants, which are a little less than 20%. So when you look at right there, we've got about 80% of all living things on Earth are just insects and plants. So clearly we should be spending a lot of our time thinking about them. They are the majority of what's going on this planet. Now, there's new species that are being found all the time. As was mentioned in the introduction, actually, I've discovered 10 new species of insects. It's soon to be 11, actually, in about a month. I will have another one described. And I've been all over the world looking for insects. I am lucky that I get to do this. I love it. And I found all these new things in remote mountain ranges and different parts of the planet. And, you realize when you do this, there is a lot that is not known, and there are so many different things that are out there. This is just a smattering of a few species that I described in the last 10 years here. But when you talk to your average person about insects, they don't care about new species. maybe they don't particularly like insects, right? And in fact, I've been at, parties, family reunions, on a plane somewhere where somebody says, "Oh, what do you do?" And you say, "I'm an entomologist. I study insects." Well, why should I care about insects? I mean, aren't insects mostly pests? I get asked this all the time, right? So how do I get rid of insects? I hate insects. And I understand that that's a very common way to think, right? It's very, very common. I mean, if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's and you go to the garden section, there is so much devoted to killing things, right? And so you see insects, when we think of insects, it's like, how do I get rid of them? Oh, here we have a bunch of different insecticides. We've got one that says killer, another one says killer, seven heaven, that's creepy, all kinds of different things out there that people are going to look at and say, this is what I want, this is what I'm going to use to kill things. And I had a neighbor, she was a very nice person, and she one time asked me, what do you spray in your trees? Because I know you're an entomologist, so what are you spraying in your trees? I said, I don't spray anything in my trees. Why do you think I do that? And she just couldn't believe that was my response. She said, well, you must be spraying something, they look nice. She didn't even know what I was trying to kill or what I should be trying to kill. It's just, you're supposed to kill things. And this is the mentality that we have. It's just, insects are bad, we need to get rid of them. It's a very dangerous mentality, and we're going to try to, hopefully make you think of some other things after this talk. But I really want to put this in context here. We have, like I said, about 1 million species of insects that have been described as of 2018. We think that there's actually somewhere between about 3 and 8 million species on Earth. We had to come up with a single estimate, somewhere around 5.5 million species. Now, how many of those are pests? How many of those are things that actually cause serious economic injury, that hurt crops of ours, that might maybe bite us, that cause medical problems, all kinds of things like that? It turns out it's less than 1,000 species, probably somewhere around 800 species are serious pests, something that you can actually quantify what they do to us that's detrimental, right? And so if you think about it, that means that over 99.99% of insects are not pests. And maybe it's time to change the way that we think, right? We care about things like spotted lanternfly. Of course we do. We have to, right? But spotted lanternfly is the exception, right? It's kind of like if you were watching the news and there was some horrible person who did some atrocious things. You don't think of all of your neighbors like that. You don't think everyone around you is a serial killer or something. You know that that's not the case. So I think we should be doing the same thing with insects. We should be happy for all the wonderful things they're doing for us, some of which I'll discuss today, and maybe focus on that a lot more than we currently do. So here's a particular insect that every single spring I get a bunch of text messages. What is this thing? How do I get rid of it, right? So this is the eastern tank caterpillar, and I want to address this one because I think it's a really good test example. Is this a pest? Is this a serious pest? Like, how much damage is this really doing? A lot of people want to get rid of it, but what's it actually doing to us? So here's a little excerpt from Department of Entomology at Auburn University, and they said, the caterpillar is most serious as a pest in urban, suburban, and wooded outdoor recreation areas. Here, unsightly webs and leafless crowns severely reduce the aesthetic value of shade, ornamental, and other landscape trees, and caterpillars, simply by their presence, often become a nuisance. Okay, so we've got aesthetics, right? It makes the trees look worse. I can understand that, right? I think this is very interesting, this last part here. Caterpillars, simply by their presence, often become a nuisance. So they're a pest because we don't like them. And we don't like them because they're a pest. Basically, we don't even have a particular reason other than we don't like them to exist. I think that's a really, really interesting thing, right? How about Missouri Botanical Garden? What do they have to say about this? Well, they said, it is not necessary to spray insecticides to control the eastern tank caterpillar. Came right out and said that. I thought that was great. Healthy defoliated trees will grow new leaves. Infested trees can be unsightly and are less vigorous than attacked trees, but they are seldom killed. I think this is a really good point, is we don't necessarily have to do anything. People don't like that. All the time I get these text messages about eastern tank caterpillars. It's, always, what do I do? What am I supposed to do? And when I say you don't need to do anything, that doesn't go over well. A lot of times there's a very angry response to that is, well, I'm just supposed to let them destroy my trees, and that's how we think. Well, what kind of benefit do they have? Maybe let's not just talk about what kind of a detrimental effect they have, but what about the benefits to wildlife? Having things like eastern tank caterpillars are really valuable to birds like this black-billed cuckoo here, right? And yellow-billed cuckoos as well. Both cuckoos love to eat tent caterpillars. It's one of their favorite things. And actually, so do 60 other species of birds. All like to eat eastern tent caterpillars. It's a great food source, high in protein, high in fat. You wouldn't think they would be palatable, but a number of birds have found ways to eat them. And here's one of my favorite ones. Here's a Baltimore oriole. They have really sharp beaks, and they will actually slit up the side of one of these tents, and then they will go in there and reach in with their beak and pull out individual caterpillars and eat them. So that tent does not stop something like a Baltimore oriole. And this is a much better food source for a Baltimore oriole than any of the other things that you might try to put out for them. Like oranges are great. That's wonderful. They love that. But this is the thing they really need even more. Now, here's one that I think is a really good example of a alleged pest that we need to reevaluate, right? This is the smear dagger moth, Acronicta oblaneta, right? It's listed in pest manuals, various field guides, extension websites as a pest or occasional pest of apples or fruit trees. Here's a cheat sheet. Whenever you hear the term occasional pest, that usually means we're not sure why someone once said it was a pest. We can't figure it out, but it doesn't really seem to do very much to hurt us on a regular basis, right? So I thought this was really interesting because Acronicta, it didn't make a lot of sense. Acronicta oblaneta should not be a pest of fruit trees. This particular moth feeds on a member of the buckwheat family, a little weed. It doesn't feed on apples. So I didn't even understand this. And I thought this was interesting. So I looked into this a little bit more. And here's a classic guide here called The Insect Enemies of Eastern Forest by Craighead. And he says in there, the genus Acronicta has nearly 100 species. They seldom, if ever, become abundant enough to cause serious defoliation. Acronictas are not common. You got to go looking for them. So it doesn't make sense to me at all. And I wanted to find out more. So here, David Wagner and his colleagues in Owlet Caterpillars of Eastern North America said, while the smeared dagger has been reported as a pest of apple and other orchard trees, it is hard to imagine any dagger being so common as to cause economic injury. More likely, its pest status is undeserved. So I had to go through and try to find out why does everybody say that this is a pest when nobody can figure out why it's a pest? And I was able to trace this back to a single study done in Missouri in the early 1900s, where they actually looked to see what types of insects walked across the leaves of apple trees. And all they had was a single record of this thing once showing up on an apple tree. That's it. There's no evidence of it feeding on apples. It doesn't. This is a specialist caterpillar that won't feed on apples. And because of the fact that it was physically present, it was automatically assumed to be a pest. And that's how we think. And I think that's a really, really insane way to go through this world, is to think of everything that we didn't put there as being a pest, right? So it's very unfortunate. And I think we should really reevaluate this. Now, there are some insects that we like for sure, right? We have some beautiful insects. If you're an insect and you want to get protection and want to be loved, be pretty, because that's the only way that you're getting on any kind of a list for protection, whether it be the Endangered Species Act or state list. And so these are all things that have either been placed on the Endangered Species Act or have been petitioned to be so. Monarch butterflies did not get approved. They were petitioned to be listed as an endangered species, but they did not get approved. So we have our Carter blue butterfly there in the upper left. Beautiful butterfly, right? We've got our Heinz green emerald there in the upper right. Wonderful dragonfly that lives only in parts of the upper Midwest in a very specific habitat. We have a tiger beetle here, right? That's what I study. Tiger beetle, the Santa Cruz tiger beetle, only found in one area so small it has an address. That is how small this species range is left on Earth. Everything that they have has been taken for housing developments and vineyards in California. So they have one last little place in Santa Cruz County, and that's the whole place that's left. But are these the only insects that deserve protection just because they're pretty? That doesn't seem right. So I think we should really try to reevaluate this as well. And maybe we should value insects more than we do. So when I get asked a question like, why should I care about insects? Well, you literally could not survive without them. No hyperbole. You could not survive without insects for a second, because the world would abruptly end all life systems. So first, let's talk about ecosystem function and ecosystem services and explain what those mean. So here's a forest very close to where I grew up in Atlantic County, New Jersey. And you walk through here and it's quiet. There's some plants, maybe you see a deer, some blue jays. But there are so many things that are going on that you can't see. They're beneath the surface. Right now, all kinds of dead leaves are deteriorating, and all kinds of things in them like nitrogen and phosphorus are being sent back into the soil and taken up by more plants. Different types of bacteria and fungi are breaking these things down and remineralizing those nutrients. There are things eating each other. There are things with mutualist relationships that are going on, fungi and plants that are using each other to help grow even better. All kinds of things are happening. And in the end, there's this whole closed system of things that are recycling within this system. And so we can call an ecosystem, and we can talk about these as ecosystem functions, right? These are things that are going on, nutrient cycling, plant biomass production, the fact that the plants are growing, all these things are happening, and this is just part of nature going on. But I think a really interesting thing to think about is how you need a lot of species in an area. The more species you have, the more things function well. There's been hundreds of studies demonstrating a positive association between biodiversity, so all the species present in an area, and the way that those ecosystems function. For example, drought, right? You could have a really bad year where things are really dry, and if you have a number of species present before the drought, it will bounce back better than if you only have a few. The number of species actually matters. We want healthy ecosystems with as much diversity as possible because they will continue to be resilient, and then we can take advantage of them for ourselves, right? And let's face it, that's what most people care about, is what is biodiversity doing for me lately? That's the way people think. Well, when you deforest areas, when you lose areas, and then it turns into, various housing developments or agricultural places that are where they're growing a crop that they can only grow for a few years, and then eventually that soil is destroyed. Well, when that happens, you get desertification. You get all kinds of terrible environmental impacts as a result of this. When you have more species around, there's less of an impact when there's bad weather, when there's extreme weather. It doesn't hurt it as bad. And we can talk about ecosystem services, which can be described as the conditions and processes through which natural ecosystems and the species that make them up sustain and fulfill human life. This is a really important thing. Like I said, people care about what is biodiversity doing for me. And biodiversity is doing quite a lot, actually, right? We could talk about all the different things and break them into categories. We could say that there are supporting services, things that are going to be necessary for all other types of ecosystem services. These are just basic ecosystem functions, things like soil formation, nutrient cycling, decomposition of dead material. This is all important stuff that goes on that keeps the world going. And then that turns into things like provisioning services, things like having food and water and medicines. Those are all things that we get when we have a functioning ecosystem. We've got regulating services, things that are more important than we ever realized, things like climate regulation. We realized a couple of years ago that lichens are actually absorbing about 50 billion tons of carbon from the air every year. And the only reason that climate change could have been much worse, much faster, is because of things like lichen. There was a great study at the Max Planck Institute showing this. And so, that's an important regulating service that we're getting from these little organisms that nobody really cares that much about. In fact, people try to scrub them off of things. Maybe we shouldn't, right? We can talk about all kinds of cultural services that biodiversity is doing for us. These are tough, though, because people don't like to discuss things when they can't put a dollar value on them. And so what is the spiritual value of biodiversity? I don't know. I would argue that there is one, but I don't know what that is. I mean, what is the cultural heritage value of an area where perhaps there's a natural area that a pipeline is being put through right now, and they're saying, we're going to make this much money. We don't care about your cultural heritage. I don't think that's right personally, but it's hard when you can't monetize it. Ecotourism, we can monetize. We like that one because we can say, all right, well, when you get bird watchers into this place in Costa Rica, you get this much money back. People like things like that. I would argue that all of these insects are involved in all of them, especially in supporting services and especially in regulating services. And I'm going to give you a few examples of these. So before I do that, I want to kind of go over this classic food pyramid that we've got here, right? This is a thing that ecologists use all the time to show the relationships, interactions between things that are autotrophs, things that make their own food, things like plants, right, and algae, and the things that eat them, things like herbivores, and then the things that are predators that eat the herbivores, and all the way up until the things that nobody eats and only eats other things, right? So we can go through this whole thing, and it's nice because the base of the pyramid is wider, and you can see that means there's more plants than there are things that eat plants, and it all makes sense. But one thing that you don't hear enough about is what's going on beneath this pyramid. This pyramid falls apart, does not exist without the part that's called the detritivore cycle. This is where things are breaking down all of those dead plants and dead animals and turning them back into nutrients that can be used by the next generation of plants and animals. This is super important. If this stops, the whole pyramid falls apart. But yet you just don't hear enough about it, right? It starts with the plants and it ends with the predators, but it doesn't have to just be portrayed that way. We should think more about the base, right? And what kinds of things are doing this? A lot of things, including fungi, various different types of things like worms, and certainly insects, especially insects and close relatives, things like these springtails. Springtails are wonderful. They're absolutely adorable. They look like they're little wind-up toy versions of what somebody thinks a bug is supposed to look like. They're super cute. Everyone thinks they're cute. You don't have to admit it, but you know that you think they're cute. And they're going to be out there, and they're like little tiny insect cows eating, grazing on algae, grazing on bacteria, grazing on fungi, and they are taking all of this stuff, and they're microscopic. These things are only about 1 millimeter or so long. Some of them are even smaller than that. And they're going to take all of that stuff that they graze on rocks and logs and dirt and dead leaves, and they are going to turn that into soil. In fact, their feces can make up 20% or more of the soil in many different environments. They are critically important to us having soil at all. And in certain places, it can be even higher than that. Now, this is a whole world that you've never seen, right? There's all these amazing and quite frankly beautiful springtails all over the world. And if these were the size of birds, we would have field guides to them. Of course we would, right? Because they're stunningly beautiful. But you'll go your whole life and never see one, even though right outside your door, right in the soil, just outside where your garden is, these are all over the place. They're just microscopic, so you don't get to see them that much. But they are keeping us alive. They are absolutely critical to our survival. The very first book ever written about springtails, called The Biology of Springtails, written in 1997, the foreword of the book, there's a very interesting paragraph where the author is basically saying, how am I the first person to write a book about springtails in 1997? These things are one of the most important groups of living things on Earth. They might be the most ubiquitous arthropods on planet Earth in terrestrial areas on the land, and yet nobody ever thought to write a book about them before. So we don't care about things that aren't hurting us. We don't care about things that we can't see what they're doing for us. But I promise you, these are doing an awful lot for us. And we can also talk about saproxylic insects. Saproxylic is a nice fun word, which just means eating dead wood, right? So saproxylic insects have a major role in recycling logs and turning them back into dirt, turning them back into soil. This is really important, right? So we've got things like this awesome insect here, which is all over New Jersey. You get to see these sometimes in the spring and the summer. This is a patent leather beetle, and they do look like patent leather for sure, right? It's like polished, black, shiny, and they're big. This is a very large beetle, and they will tunnel through logs, and they form these colonies. They're actually social, and they'll form colonies, and they communicate with each other with squeaks and clicks that they make. It's really neat. And as they do this, they eat the wood, they tunnel through it. Ultimately, they just pulverize up a lot of the log, and that log becomes dirt quicker than it would have otherwise. So they really speed up the process and turn dead trees back into dirt. We have things like this beautiful Tenebriana beetle. This is a type of darkling beetle that we don't even know that much about what they do. Even though they're all over South Jersey, they're found in the Pine Barrens in particular. We think that they eat fungi underneath bark, but like so many species out there, we just don't know because they don't hurt us, so we don't spend money studying them. But who knows what they do exactly? We're fairly sure that ultimately they are involved in recycling nutrients, but we don't know exactly. So let's go back to why should I care about insects? You couldn't survive without them. Specifically, another reason is your food depends upon them. Being able to eat is important, right? Now, plants, we know that insects eat plants, but you know what? Plants really need insects too. Plants rely heavily on pollinators. Nearly 90% of plants are pollinated entirely or at least occasionally by insects, right? And what is that worth to us? Well, the estimated value of pollinating services to agriculture in the United States is about $40 billion a year. Now, that is a ton of money, and that was in 2005. I'm not sure what it would be now. It's a ton of money, but here's the thing. That is nothing compared to the fact that you can eat. Because what dollar value can you put on the fact that you don't starve, right? This is hugely important. Nothing is more important than being able to be alive. Jobs don't matter. Money doesn't matter if you're not alive, right? So being alive is, I think, the thing that trumps everything else here. Now, when you think about pollinators, we often go immediately in our heads to European honeybees, right? They're not from here. We brought them over. They certainly do a significant amount of pollination of crops in North America, but not as much as we thought. We're learning more and more, as I'll talk about in a second, that many of our native bees and other native pollinators are actually doing quite a lot more. And we have thousands of species of native bees, and you just don't hear about them that much. Although I know that in this excellent series, there are some people talking about some other scientists who are going to be talking about native bees. And we've lost a lot of our honeybee colonies, although they bounce back. But there are questions as to why do we see sudden die off of colonies at times? And there's a number of different reasons. And one of them is we don't have a lot of diversity of plants. That's the surprising thing. Is people talk about pesticides, of course. People talk about various mites that have been introduced into beehives, absolutely. But one of the biggest things is we have large agricultural areas with almost no plant diversity, and it's just not healthy for the things that are trying to get their nutrients from those plants. And here are a couple of our native bees that we can see here. We've got an Andrina on the top, and we have an Agapostamon, which we're going to talk about in a minute, on the bottom. Some of them are quite beautiful. I would argue that some of our native bees are as beautiful as any bees I've seen anywhere on Earth, and I've traveled to 20 different countries. And we have some stunningly beautiful bees in New Jersey. So people have asked me before, without honeybees, could we survive? Well, we could. In fact, some native species are much more efficient than European honeybees anyway. In this particular one here, orchard mason bees, it takes as few as 250 of them to pollinate an acre of apples. It would take about 40,000 honeybees to do the same. This was a research study out of University of Guelph. And so that is a huge differential, right? That's a huge, huge differential. These things are incredibly efficient. And there are a number of agricultural crops that cannot be pollinated by European honeybees or are inefficiently pollinated by European honeybees and will not be efficiently pollinated unless our native pollinators are present. And in fact, I'm showing you a bunch of things, and I know that this is not necessarily always the most popular thing because I realize that, people do like to rent honeybees. I understand that. And people rent honeybees to pollinate things like blueberries, but there's a lot of research that says actually our native pollinators are better pollinators of blueberries, pumpkins, various squashes, members of the family of the nightshade family, which includes tomatoes and eggplants, members of the family Ericaceae, the heath family, which includes not only our blueberries, but this flower over here. And if you're wondering what is that flower, that is a cranberry. And in fact, cranberries are named because it looks like the nodding head of a crane. And so it changed from cranberry to craneberry to cranberry. And so that's where that comes from. And one of the reasons I'm showing that particular flower is because honeybees are very, very bad at pollinating downward pointing flowers. They're just not fit to do it very well. We do need a lot of our native pollinators to do that. So here's one of the most powerful research studies I have ever read. I read this in 2014. Wild pollinators enhance fruit set of crops regardless of honeybee abundance. This was a powerful, powerful study, and I will just read to you a little bit of an excerpt and put it in context here. Okay, so they said, the diversity and abundance of wild insect pollinators have declined in many agricultural landscapes. Absolutely, lots of evidence for this. Whether such declines reduce crop yields or are mitigated by managed pollinators such as honeybees is unclear. It's a lot more clear now. We found universally positive associations of fruit set with flower visitation by wild insects in 41 crop systems worldwide. So let me explain why this is so important. This isn't a study of blueberries in New Jersey. This is a study of crops on planet Earth, right? This is the entire world. And out of all of the crop systems that they've looked at, they've seen the same pattern. This is not some idiosyncratic single study in one geographic area, right? In contrast, fruit set increased significantly with flower visitation by honeybees in only 14% of the systems surveyed. So what that means is 86% of the time, even if you throw more honeybees at the problem, it doesn't actually do anything. The plants are not pollinated more efficiently just by throwing more honeybees at it. Very rarely does it work. Overall, wild insects pollinated crops more effectively. An increase in wild insect visitation enhanced fruit set by twice as much as an equivalent increase in honeybee visitation. So here, I'm going to show you a little bit here. Look at, if you look at the figure A, you can see the blue is pollen deposition, which is how much pollen is getting on the insect and then actually getting onto the next plant where it's supposed to be. And then the orange is fruit set. And you can see honeybees are getting tons of pollen on them. So we assumed that they were doing more pollination, but just because they're getting pollen on them doesn't mean it's getting to the right parts of the next flower, right? So they're not very efficient at transferring it the way that the flowers need it. And so we see the fruit set is lower than wild insects. Even though wild insects don't get as much pollen on them, they tend to get them to the right parts of the flowers. So that's a very interesting thing that we're seeing. And over here, we can see in all of these different agricultural crops, whether they be almonds or watermelons or mangoes or whatever, every case, there's a comparison between wild insects and honeybees. The wild insects are doing more of the pollination than the honeybees, with no exception. It's not even like this is the majority of the time. This is every time. In some cases, there were only wild insects, and in some cases, there were only honeybees. So you can't make a comparison there. So this is a powerful, powerful thing. And when I gave this talk in another place, I actually had somebody at the end of the talk say to me, you know, this is really inspiring. It's amazing to see how important these wild insects are. And, you know, what I want to know is, how do I purchase wild insects? Where can we get them so that we can use these wild insects? And it was a serious question. And I realized that that's how we think, right? We think, can I buy this? Can I buy my way, you know, out of this problem? And I said, well, the thing is, you can't buy them because they're wild insects. What this means is these are insects that are being attracted naturally. Nobody put them there. Nobody put them on a truck and drove them to a new spot. They're being attracted naturally to a certain geographic area, and they're present probably because there's good habitat for them. So I say, well, you can't buy wild insects. What you can do is create better conditions to attract wild insects, right? So if you have a diverse array of things like native plants to your region, in your garden, in your yards, in your landscape, along the edge of your agricultural fields, whatever, that's going to do a really great job. And I see this as inspiring. I see this as, well, this is a great message that we can't just buy something. We have to make it better. We have to work harder, but we can make it better. So that's what I see from this. Now, when you look at the pollinators for the world's flowering plants, there's about 240,000 species of flowering plants in the whole world. What is pollinating them? You're going to be really surprised by this. I actually know one of the authors of this study. I worked with him when I was in Panama, and I wasn't surprised because I work on beetles, but beetles are the majority, the vast majority of flowering plants on Earth are pollinated at least some of the time by beetles. Now, note that these don't add up to 100% because many types of flowers can be pollinated by different types of pollinators, right? But beetles pollinate almost 90% of flowering plants on Earth. That's crazy, right? That seems very surprising. You have to understand, a lot of these are tropical plants, right? The vast majority of plants are in the tropics. So this is not going to be true here. In New Jersey, it's not even close to that, right? I don't know what it would be because nobody's done that study in New Jersey. But the point is that there are a lot of plants that are pollinated by beetles. And in fact, there are actually quite a few in our area too. I'll show you some. And so things like wasps pollinate about 18%, bees about the same. And that's right, wasps pollinate slightly more than bees. And that is very surprising again to most people. but a lot of these things are going to be surprising, right? Wind pollinates about 8% of plants. Butterflies and moths about the same. Flies about 6%, but much higher here. Where we live in New Jersey, flies are actually very significant pollinators. Other types of things, including birds like hummingbirds, pollinate a small number. Bats actually pollinate 165 species of plants, including agave. And what do we get from agave? Agave nectar and also tequila. Those are things we get from agave. But anyway, so bats are a small percentage, but insects are clearly a giant percentage of this. And let's talk about some of those. Like I said, beetles are pollinating many different plant lineages, but they're especially prevalent on members of the magnolia family. This is going to be where we're going to see so many different beetle pollinated species. This here, you can see the beetles are going to be these little tiny kind of wedge-shaped things with the sharper tail. These are called tumbling flower beetles. They're going to be all over the place on magnolias, sometimes on members of the daisy family as well, and other types of plants. Many of the reasons why you don't see beetles, because I've had people say to me, I've never seen beetles in a flower. You're telling me that beetles are commonly pollinating flowers? Many of the reasons you don't see them are because they can be small. They can be there only for a few days of the whole year. Some of them are only going to be active at night. And so unless you're getting your face really down deep into the flower, you might not even notice something like these particular types of beetles are pollinating this flower right here. And then we have other ones. They're going to have bright colors, but sometimes they're going to look like they're not beetles. Some of them look like they're wasps or bees or something else. And so a lot of them are going to be mimicking another type of insect, and that's going to make it tough to tell that they're beetles. Now, flies are important pollinators, very much so, especially in the spring and the fall. Maybe not quite as much in the middle of the summer, but in the fall in particular, when lots of our other pollinators are gone, flies are really important, right? We have entire species of plants that are only pollinated by flies. Many species of plants are only pollinated by flies. And when you look at the one there in the lower right, that is a mosquito. And sometimes I don't know what normal people know. And so my wife will tell me. And so I said to her, do people know that mosquitoes are a type of fly? And she said, no, people don't know that. I was like, really? Okay, so if you didn't know that, mosquitoes are a type of fly. They're a weird type of fly, but they are a type of fly. And so people don't like mosquitoes as pollinators because we like good guys and bad guys. We don't like complicated things, you know. And so this is one of those situations where a number of species of mosquitoes are pollinators of different things, including a couple of rare orchids. And again, I know that's not a popular thing to say, but it's the truth, right? Sometimes things are complicated. Now, here's a really interesting one. This particular flower, which comes right off the side of this shrub or small tree, is pollinated only by this one little genus of midges. And this is a really, really interesting thing because what this turns into is chocolate. That's right. Without flies, there would be no chocolate. You're not eating flies when you eat chocolate, so don't get freaked out, but they are turning those flowers into those cacao tree fruits, and those get like ground up and roasted and fermented and goes through all these different steps. And ultimately, you can't have chocolate without these flies because they are the ones that make that fruit. So yes, if you like chocolate, and you do, thank flies. And of course, butterflies can be pollinators too. They're not as important to pollinators as people tend to think that they are, but you know, certainly they do some as well. These are some local butterflies that one could find around here. So another thing I want to bring up here is, you know, when people say, why should I care about insects? If you like birds, you can't like birds and not like insects because birds cannot survive without insects. Overwhelmingly, 96% of birds have to eat insects at some point in their life. And here's a good example of one. This is a beautiful Blackburnian warbler, and these are caterpillar eating machines. Here's a Blackburnian warbler with a geometric caterpillar, which is a type of inchworm, right? And it looks like a twig. Didn't fool him. He's a professional caterpillar finder, but it would fool most things into thinking that it was a twig. And in this case, the bird knows that it's food. Here's a another warbler with a really big caterpillar. Good meal here. Good job with that one. And then sometimes I hear people say, well, I feed birds, and there's lots of birds that come to my feeder. It's a very, very small, yes, it's a palm warbler. I just blanked for a second. I'm like, is it a palm or is it a prairie? I just blanked for 1 second there, but thank you. It's the palm warbler. Um, and a lot of people say to me, I feed birds, and so they're going to eat things like berries and seeds, and they'll be fine. But you know what? These are not just seed and fruit eaters. These still have to feed their young caterpillars. Doug Tallamy has been given some great talks about this in a bunch more detail than I'm going to get into. But I know he's had some talks where he talks about chickadees and how they can't really feed their young seeds. They really do need caterpillars. They need insects. The fats and proteins in insects are going to be different than the nutrients that they're going to get from seeds. And so if you want to have the next generation of birds, you need to have caterpillars. You need to have insects. You can't just have seeds. Okay, so hopefully I've made it clear that there's some really important reasons to have insects around. And now I want to talk to you a little bit at the end here about how to promote insects in your yards. So Jersey Friendly Yards actually has on their website some great information here about minimizing risk when managing pests. There's a way to do this, and it's not easy. I mean, nobody's going to tell you it's easy, right? Nothing done right is easy, but if you want to really do it right, there are ways to do this, and you can manage pests using safer, non-toxic methods. And even the toxic methods don't work that well either, because a lot of times people say, well, I just want the easy solution that's going to fix my problems. Spraying pesticides doesn't just fix your problems. It really doesn't. So how to promote pollinators specifically? Well, eliminate pesticides or minimize their use as much as possible. There's again, no way around this, because most pesticides do not discriminate. They just kill insects. And so they don't care whether they're, quote, good insects or bad insects. Doesn't matter. They're going to be toxic to insects in general. So I don't spray anything in my yard. I am incredibly lazy and incredibly environmentally conscious. So it's great. It works out. All the things that I do best are the things that I don't do. I don't spray anything. I don't fertilize my lawn. I don't water my lawn. I don't use fungicides or herbicides or pesticides. I don't use any of that stuff. And it's actually funny because my neighbors seem to think my yard looks pretty good. It's interesting. I've been able to do it in a way that's just not going to use a lot of inputs. And this is a particular insect here, beautiful insect called a mantispid. And these are going to be things I find in my yard. I don't know if I would find them if I sprayed a lot of insecticides. I suspect I would not. Here's something that I get in my yard because I don't spray. Now, I get on my viburnum dentatum, my arrowwood viburnum, I get major pest problems sometimes. The first year that I planted them, I got tons and tons and tons of aphids, and they were just all over my plants. And I could have gone the easy way and said, let me spray something. But I said, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to take a lot of damage the first year, and things will get better in the following years. And that's exactly what happened, right? Took a lot of damage the first year, but what happened was I attracted a number of predators that set up residence and are now there permanently, and the pest problems never are that bad now. And so I know this doesn't always work out so beautifully, but it did for me. So here we can see this is a syrphid fly larva or a hoverfly larva, right? So we showed you a picture of an adult. And here's another one, and it's eating aphids. And this is great. So they came in, they started eating my aphids. And syrphid flies are just so wonderful. They're beneficial throughout all parts of their life cycle. The larvae are going to be eating aphids, and the adults are pollinating flowers. What more can you ask for, right? They're doing kind of every beneficial thing that you could really expect from a single group, right? And then I started getting things like soldier beetles coming in, and they also eat aphids. And so I was happy to see those. Now, I have many ground beetles in my yard, and I don't think it's just because I study ground beetles, because tiger beetles are in the ground beetle group. I think it's I think it's because I don't spray anything on my lawn, and so my lawn is not toxic, and therefore they're doing just fine. If you lift up a trash can lid in July on the side of my yard, you will find tons and tons of different kinds of ground beetles. And some of them are I think quite beautiful. Actually, I think that the one here on the right is a stunning thing. It's called the tricolor or the vivid tricolored ground beetle. All of them are predaceous on things like slugs, snails, Japanese beetle grubs, and other types of insects like those. And so I used to have a slug problem. When I first moved in, we had major slug problems. You couldn't walk around the yard at night in the summer because you, oh God, I just stepped on another slug. You know, it was not pleasant. I don't have any slug problems now. And I think the thing is, the previous owners of the house sprayed stuff in the lawn. I know they did because I found stuff in the shed. And once I stopped spraying, just a year or two later, things bounced back. And so now the slug problems were under control. And speaking of slugs, I think here's a really, really great lesson. This is a study out of Penn State University. And I'm going to explain to you what's going on in the study, and I think it'll be really surprising and interesting. So neonicotinoid insecticide, and that's a very common type of pesticide, travels through a soil food chain, disrupting biological control of non-target pests and decreasing soybean yield. I'm going to explain to you what this means. It's a fascinating study that was done here. Okay, so in these agricultural fields, they started coating seeds, right? They started coating soybean seeds with a particular type of toxic chemical called a neonicotinoid. It's incredibly efficient at killing insects. It only kills insects. It doesn't kill other things. It doesn't kill slugs, but it kills insects. So they were coating these, and you say, why? They don't know. There was not a particular pest they were trying to kill. It was just kill first, don't ask questions later. Just kill stuff, right? And this is a dangerous, dangerous mentality, because what happened is this ended up backfiring badly on them. So they were putting this chemical on these seeds, and then they were finding that slugs were getting out of control, and they didn't know why at first, and then they figured it out. The slugs could eat the seeds. Slugs were never a pest. They were just never that common because the ground beetles kept them under control. But the slugs are there moving around at night, eating these toxic seeds. The toxin doesn't affect the slugs. And then at night, later on, these beetles, like this Clenius tricolor, would come through, try to eat the slugs, die trying to eat the slugs because they'd be poisoned by the toxin that is now inside of the slugs. And so now all of a sudden, these fields are overrun with toxic slugs that can't be killed and are just suddenly becoming incredibly numerous. And you can see in this graph here, all of the circles that are black are the ones that have the pesticide on them, and the circles that are open are the ones that do not have any chemical added. And you can see here, slugs per trap, there are more slugs when they treat them with this insecticide, right? That's interesting. That's not what you would think intuitively. You say if you put an insecticide on your seeds, you wouldn't think that your slug numbers are going to go up, but they do for the reason I just explained. And the number of soybean plants in a hectare is much higher when you do nothing than when you do something, right? And also, this is a great antidote to this mentality of, well, we have to do something. Actually, doing something could be much worse than doing nothing, right? And then we see here, here's the kicker. This is money and food, yield here of soybeans. The yield of soybeans was always highest when they did nothing. When they sprayed them with insecticides, it was always lowest. So I think that is really, really powerful. And it says we really should think things through rather than just brute force, kill insects, hope it works out. Okay, so how can you promote beneficial native insects? Create pollinator habitat. There's a way to do this. And again, on Jersey Friendly Yards, they have some great information on this. I'm not going to read all of it to you, but you should check it out. They have information about landscaping for pollinators. And here's the thing that might be surprising, but most species of bees don't build hives or live in colonies. Honeybees are weird. They're not typical of bees. Most bees nest in the ground and either do it by themselves or in loose family groups, but they don't have like a queen that they defend, and they have worker bees, and it doesn't work like that. Most species kind of do their own thing and maybe live in a communal area. And most of them are going to be, like I said, in the ground, right? So if you have nothing but a pure manicured lawn from edge to edge, and there's nowhere where there's any gaps, no bare ground, they're not going to be there. 70% of our bees nest in the ground. So without bare ground, bees go away. And again, I know that's not convenient, right? People don't want to have bare ground, but if there's anywhere where you can tolerate just a little bit of it, it would be a good thing. And here's one of our native metallic green bees. And you can see how big of an area they need. It's not very big at all. there's pieces of clover in the background for comparison of size here. This is not a big area, but they need little patches. And honestly, I don't think anything is more beautiful than Agapossamon splendens. I mean, they're stunning bees, really stunning. And there's one with its head right near the surface. They like to hang out in these little holes in the ground. Some bees nest in sticks, dead vegetation, or holes previously dug by other organisms. See, I think this looks cool. I'm glad that someone else does. There seem to be two opinions on this. Either that looks so cool and it's rustic, or that looks like a pile of stuff. You know, that seems to be the other opinion. Is some of my family members see this and then they say, why would you ever want that? And I say, I think that looks cool, personally. But if you don't like something that unkempt, you can get a mason bee house that you can either buy from Amazon, or if you're handy, you could build one yourself from plans. There's lots of plans around there. It's very easy to build one. And this is a particular type of bee that I mentioned earlier. It's a highly efficient pollinator of many different kinds of flowers. And not only that, they like to live in already made holes in a structure. So it's very easy to make a house for them. I'm not going to read this to you, but here's another source of information is xerces.org. Look this up. They actually have an entire page of just Pennsylvania and New Jersey native bee habitat. Just that. So I think there's some great information out there. And your native bees are not likely to sting. In fact, many of them cannot sting. So one of the things that I get asked on a regular basis is, well, if I attract all these native pollinators and I get all these native bees, aren't I at risk of being stung? No. They're not defending a queen. They're not defending a colony. They have no reason to be aggressive. None at all. These are not wasps. These are not honeybees. These are native bees that are super unlikely to sting. And in fact, you can see how afraid I was of this female Calides thoracicus. I had her in my hand and I took a picture and my wife was like, why do you have a bee in your hand? Aren't you afraid you're going to get stung? I'm like, no, she's totally chill. I'm chill. There's no reason to be upset. And it was fine. All right, and the last point that I want to bring up here is try to use native plants whenever possible. We'll give you a little quick overview of that, and then we'll wrap up for some questions. Why does it matter? Well, let's put this in context here, okay? So there's lots of different flowers out there that will attract butterflies. And if you go to Home Depot or Lowe's or somewhere like that, and you say, I would like to attract butterflies, they will direct you to this plant, Buddleia davidii, right? Also known as butterfly bush. I've seen it listed as summer lilac, but I've never heard anybody actually call it that. This is native to Eastern Asia and is heavily promoted by the horticultural industry. And it is one of those things where you will definitely see adult butterflies. There's no question the adult butterflies love to use it. But adult butterflies are kind of like people running a marathon. They're at the very end of the process. When you run a marathon, you might be grabbing some water or some Gatorade as you're running by a station, and that's great. And that's what you're getting. And this is basically what they're getting. They're getting nectar, which is going to be water and sugar and electrolytes, just like a Gatorade type thing. But you had to spend months or years training for it and eating real food. You can't live on Gatorade alone, right? And so, insects have multiple life stages, and all of them include an immature stage that does most to all of the feeding in that species lifespan. And so while those red admiral butterflies and those monarch butterflies might be attracted to the flowers of a butterfly bush, they could never get to be adults by feeding on it. In fact, there's not one single species of insect native to North America that can complete its life cycle on butterfly bush. All they can get is nectar from it. And again, nectar is a cool thing. That's not the end of the world, but you need the real food. The real food that the babies have to eat is what you absolutely need. And they all have a very specific thing that they feed on. I shouldn't say they all have. About 90% of insects feed on one or a few different very specific sources of food. In the case of red admirals, they feed on stinging nettle. And in the case of monarch butterflies, they feed on milkweeds. So all the butterfly bush in the world is not going to make the next generation of butterflies. You could use something native that attracts things for nectar and for food, something like butterfly weed or butterfly milkweed, Asclepias tuberosa. This is a wonderful native milkweed that is going to provide all of the nectar benefits, but is also going to, feed the larvae of different species, including monarchs, right? And these are different things that live on butterfly weed, right? And it is absolutely easy to grow. It's a wonderful plant, highly recommend it. And think about how many flowers are that beautiful bright orange color. You know, it's a really nice thing to have. Different types of insects love it. I actually made a list of highly recommended native plants of the mid-Atlantic. This takes into account 7 different criteria, whether it's good as a host plant for different species of butterflies and moths, whether it's deer resistant, its value in seeds and fruits, all kinds of different things were factored in here. And none of these is going to check all 7 boxes, but all of them were at least 5 of 7 criteria. And these are things that are relatively easy to get and are all attractive. So, or at least, again, attractive is subjective, but people have many times in the past told me they really like these. I have this as a 1-page PDF. If anybody's interested, I can provide that to the moderators afterwards too. So we only have a couple of minutes, but I want to really quickly go through a couple of these. Here's one of my favorites. Short-toothed mountain mints, fantastic plant. Pycnanthemum muticum, and also Pycnanthemum incanum, which is another related one. These are wonderful, wonderful plants. You can't go wrong with this. In fact, you could almost argue that objectively, this is the best pollinator plant. And the reason I say that is there was a study out of Penn State that when all the native plants that they looked at in the eastern United States, this had the highest diversity of pollinators present, the total highest abundance of pollinators present, and the longest flowering time. So, you know, you had massive, massive benefits of these, and they look nice and they smell nice. There's only one downside, and it's a mint, right? So anyone who does gardening knows that means they're hell-bent on world domination. But at the same time, honestly, you can keep it under control. You just have to be on top of it. You know, they are going to send runners out. They are going to take over. But it's a great thing to have. Highly recommended. Now, here's one of my favorites. I don't think gets enough credit, which is serviceberry. Right? We have several species in our area, but not only that, there are a number of other ones native to northern and western North America that are all native enough that the things here would love them. So all serviceberries are native to North America. So great plants, cannot recommend them enough. They look beautiful in the spring. They look like cherry blossoms because they're very closely related to cherries. And then they produce beautiful and unbelievably tasty fruits if you actually feel like eating them. They're fantastic. In fact, they're trying to make this a new fruit crop in upstate New York. It's already grown extensively in Manitoba for food. Great, great plant. It attracts wonderful pollinators like this beautiful Leda enea. This is a blister beetle. All kinds of butterflies, all kinds of things. Just a great plant all around. And then Cornell University Ornithology Laboratory lists this in their top 5 most valuable fruit trees for birds. You have all kinds of things that like to eat the birds and that sometimes eat the caterpillars that are on the leaves as well. So really great. All right, and so with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Hey, thank you, Dan. That was really awesome. And
Incredible.
I just want to jump in with a couple related questions that people asked about the bee hotels. One was, do the bee hotels make them too vulnerable, make the bees too vulnerable to parasitic predators? And then part 2 of that from another person is, should the bee hotels be small and scattered so they're less open to predators?
Okay, so that's a great question. And I want to be very clear that I am not an expert on bee hotels. But that's a really, really great question. Okay, so the first part is, yeah, if you have a density of insects, something like a native bee, like whatever you're getting in there, they may be at higher risk of getting hit by parasites, but they regularly occur in numbers like that in the wild anyway. So I would imagine it's not a major problem. That's, I could try to talk to one of my colleagues about that one and see if I can get a little bit more information. But my understanding is it is not a problem, right? You're always going to be at risk of some parasites, but they've been dealing with this for a long time. So it's probably not the end of the world.
Thank you. This is kind of a funny question, but are free-range chickens a threat to the insect population?
They are where the chickens roam. Chickens are amazing insect eaters. You know, you can use that to your benefit. Like if you were growing crops and you had, you know, an area where you could fence chickens around it, then, you know, you could have them eating things like Japanese beetles or whatever. That's always a possibility. But I don't think there's enough generally free range chickens out there that they're going to be doing, you know, major damage to insects. So I wouldn't worry about that.
A lot of people requested your PDF about the native plants. So
Yeah.
if you can share it with me, I'm going to put it up on the webinar webpage so they can just go there and access it that way, if that's okay with
Absolutely.
you.
Right after this session, I will send that to you in email and then you can share that with everyone. I kind of
Thank you.
forgot to do that ahead of time.
Trying to see. Does anybody else see any questions? Oh, wait, here's one. What are the beetles that show up on milkweed? You showed a picture on the milkweed
Oh,
slide. Should they
yeah, so
be
those
should
are
they be encouraged?
yeah, they're
Asking.
great. I mean, they're wonderful native insects. Those are tetraopes, or also known as milkweed longhorn beetles. And they are, you know, they're really great. So they're all specialists on some species of milkweed. All of them only eat one type of milkweed, which is really interesting.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Regarding bee hotels, I was kind of poking around in my garden this weekend and noticed that I'm probably going to pronounce this incorrectly, hibiscus mosquitoes, like
That's how I say it. That's how I
swamp
say it.
rose.
Yep.
It actually has hollow stems, and I thought, ooh, that looks like a really, great place for bees to overwinter, or even, when it's time to clip the stems down and then to bundle them together for, a bee hotel.
That
Is that
yeah,
appropriate?
yeah, it's crimson-eyed mallow, or there's different names for it. Hibiscus mosquitoes absolutely is a fantastic plant for that. Just as you said, you know, when you look at the structure of it, if you cut them across the grain and make some lengths of them that way and bundle them together, they're great. It's a fantastic option.
Do you happen to know of any other native plants that have hollow stems or
Yeah.
stems that are appropriate for bees?
So another good one to use is dogbane. Dogbane works really well. Yep, Joe Pye wheat is another great. Someone just said in the chat, dogbane is one of my favorites for that. Joe Pye wheat's great. You know, and you know what you can also do? You can get rid of an invasive if you cut down some Phragmites. Phragmites is fantastic for that too. And why not, you know, kind of kill two birds with one stone type thing, you know?
Dan, I do see a question. This is Susan. Sorry, came in a little late. That somebody wanted to know how much of a problem are cats to birds, and that may not be your specialty, but that was in the chat.
Definitely a different topic, but I can tell you they're a major problem to birds. I've certainly heard that from a number of people that have looked in that problem. So it's not my area, but I'm pretty confident to say that yes, feral cats are a big problem to birds, and maybe even domestic cats. I know people put bells on their necks to keep them from, you know, to make them harder to sneak up on birds.
So someone is saying, please tell me something positive about earwigs.
I don't have anything negative to say about them. I mean, they're omnivores. You know, they're really good at fitting into food webs. You know, they get eaten by things and they eat lots of other things, and you know, they're nicely integrated into food webs. That's about all I can say.
A lot of folks really enjoy your program. A lot of
Oh,
compliments.
awesome. Great.
And I'm impressed at how you can multitask. You just presented and saw questions pop in and answered them, without skipping a beat.
It's being a professor.
Oh, one last quick question. Someone's asking if we should cut the tops of Joe Pye weed, or I guess any hollow stem plant, in the fall for the bees. Just the tops, I think she's asking.
I don't know. That seems reasonable. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a great answer for that one, but I mean, that seems to, not be a bad idea.
And you offered lots of great scientific research. And can you offer a good reference for maybe a homeowner, a guide for garden insects?
Oh, that's such a great question. And this is shocking to me, but nobody's ever asked me that before. People always ask me for identification guides for butterflies or moths or beetles or something specific, but nobody's ever I mean, I can tell you the best guide to just insects in general, like if you just want to know what you have, is I think the Kaufman Guide to Insects of Eastern North America. That's a really, really good one. You're going to find that like 90% of the things that you come across are going to be in there. No guide can be comprehensive because there's just too many insects. But what was the question again? Just want to make sure I got that right.
If you have a good reference guide for garden insects.
Okay, so I would say that'll cover most of your garden insects pretty well. I don't have a guide for specifically garden insects, but that's a great guide to insects in general. I saw something about milky spore, and I can say milky spore I think is a fantastic option. Maybe one of the best options for controlling Japanese beetles. And because one of the reasons why it's so good is because it's specific. And yes, I was talking about the Kaufman Guide for Insects. Yes. One of the reasons why I like milky spore is because it has very little collateral damage. Like there are things that people put in the soil like nematodes, which might kill pests, but they also don't know what's a pest or not. So if you're trying to get rid of Japanese beetle grubs, milky spore is a really, really excellent thing. And I've read some good data that says it does work. And I know people that have told me it's worked well for them. I mean, I'm not an extension expert here. I study beetle systematics, but I can tell you that I know a number of people that swear by it, and I've read some research that says it actually is very effective.
So there was one question that I missed. Someone was saying that they started a native plant garden next to a raised bed vegetable garden and then noticed far fewer pests. So he's wondering, have there been any studies on the relationship between native plants and local vegetable garden pests such as cabbage worms?
I'm sure there have been. There's a lot of stuff out there on this. It's almost an overwhelming amount. And so I can't give you a particular study. That's not what my day job is. Like, in other words, I'm more studying insect biodiversity and how we know the relationships between different groups of insects. But I can tell you, I know there has been a lot of research done on that, and that's been a strategy, which is to try to attract. There's things called insectary strips, which you use to try to attract predators and parasitoids, and then they in turn go to the adjacent area and attack the pests that are there. So I'm curious, what kinds of, did you have members of the carrot family? When you said you have a native plant garden next to your vegetable garden, did you have anything in the carrot family? Do you happen to know?
We'll see if he answers. It's Mark, are you still there?
Dill that I let go to flower. Yeah.
Ah, there we go. Dill.
So the number of members of that family are supposed to be highly attractive to parasites and parasitoids and predators. So, that could be it, kind of got
There was-
behind the questions here. I think there's a bunch.
There was one that came to me directly too, Dan. I'm sorry, this is Susan. Can you ask how to prevent hive beetles? I don't know if you know anything about honeybee hive beetles.
I do not.
Okay.
You know, I'm not an apiculturalist, and I would be just completely conjecturing. I don't know. I don't know enough about that.
Rutgers has got a big bee class coming up if anybody is looking for it.
Yeah, I would say Rutgers Extension would be where I would go if I want to know the answer to that.
And we also have Heather Holm coming up as a speaker in our
fantastic.
series.
Mm,
Great.
May. Okay. I think we covered it, unless somebody sees any that we missed.
And Dr. Duran has kindly offered his email address right there on the screen if you have any further questions. Great. I really, really enjoyed this program. I think everybody did. Lots of compliments coming in. It was just chock full of excellent science-based information, photos, beautiful photos, graphs, data, everything. So thank you so much. And Jersey Friendly Yards screenshots.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem. Okay, great. Well, thanks for having me.
Thank you,
so
Dan.
much.
All right.
We'll be looking for more presentations in the future by Dr. Dan Duran.
Definitely.
And if you're interested in tiger beetles, buy my book. Sorry, shameless plug. I never do
And-
that, but I figured I would just.
Will there be a sequel? Tiger
maybe.
beetles.
Definitely
All
plug
right.
your YouTube video on tiger beetles that you did for the New Jersey Pinelands Commission maybe a month or two ago. On their
Oh, okay.
It's available on their YouTube page.
Maybe we can put a link to that up there too, for whoever's
there you go.
interested. Yeah.
I was like trying to remember. I'm like, oh, I gave a talk about tiger beetles to them. I totally forgot. Okay. Well,
All right. Thank you.
and we'll talk to you all later.
Excellent.
Okay,
Have a great
thanks
night. Thank you
again.
so much. Bye-bye now.
I'm hanging on. You can all go. I'm just hanging on so I can see the chat.
All
So
right.
it
Excellent. And you
takes
can
me a couple
probably
minutes.
hit record to unrecord.
Yes, thank you. I did forget to do that.
Karen, thank you so much for hosting the program. It was really, really, really wonderful.